Imagine it's 1912, Tokyo. The city is mourning the death of its great emperor Meiji, the man who transformed Japan from a reclusive feudal society into a modern world power. As the funeral procession makes its way through the city, one of the nation's most celebrated heroes, a decorated general named Nogi Maresuke, sits down in his home. He is not watching the procession. He is preparing to die. And in the next room, his wife, Nogi Shizuko, is doing the same. Their shocking, joint suicide would become a global sensation, seen as the ultimate act of loyalty. But it was also the final, dramatic example of a much older and far more hidden tradition. The ritual suicide of the samurai wife. Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're exploring the solemn world of Jigai, the final act of devotion for the women of the samurai class. This isn't just a tragic footnote to the famous stories of male samurai warriors. It's a practice that reveals the very soul of the samurai code, a world where love, loyalty, and honor were bound together so tightly that for some, life was impossible without them. To understand why a samurai wife would choose to follow her husband in death, we have to step into her world. It was a world governed by a strict code of conduct called Bushido, the way of the warrior. For a male samurai, the highest virtue was chugi, or absolute loyalty to his feudal lord, his daimyo. This bond was considered more important than family, more important than life itself. For a samurai wife, this exact same principle was mirrored in her relationship with her husband. He was the lord of her household, and her loyalty to him was expected to be just as absolute. Another core tenet was meiyo, or honor. A life lived in shame was considered far worse than death. And so, the samurai class developed a unique relationship with mortality. A famous line from an 18th century text on Bushido says, "The way of the samurai is found in death." This didn't mean they were suicidal. It meant they had to conquer their fear of dying to be truly free and courageous. This philosophy didn't stop at the door of the training dojo. It permeated the entire samurai household, shaping the lives of its women just as much as its men. Women in the samurai class lived lives of privilege, but also of extreme restriction. Marriages were almost never about love. They were political tools, strategic alliances to unite powerful families. A woman was essentially a pawn in these negotiations, and her primary duty was to her husband's family. Her life was dedicated to managing the household, defending it in times of war, and raising the next generation of warriors. But her training went beyond domestic skills. While young men learned to master the katana, young women were trained to use a small dagger called a kaiken. This dagger was a standard part of her wedding gifts. It was a tool for self-defense, yes, but it had a much deeper, much darker purpose. It was for jigai, ritual suicide. From a young age, a samurai woman was taught that her chastity and her family's honor were everything. If she were ever captured and faced the threat of disgrace, suicide was the expected, honorable way out. This training normalized the idea that her own death was a tool she must be prepared to use to protect her husband's honor. So when her husband died, her entire world collapsed. Her identity was so completely tied to his that for some, continuing to live felt like a betrayal of every principle she had ever been taught. The ritual itself, jigai, was very different from the male version of ritual suicide that we all know as seppuku, or harakiri. Seppuku involves a warrior disemboweling himself, a slow and agonizing process designed to prove his courage. Jigai was designed to be quicker, and crucially, to preserve a woman's modesty even in death. Here's how it was done. The woman would typically go to a private room in her home and dress in a pure white kimono, the traditional color of death in Japan. She would then kneel down and do something very specific. She would take a silk cord and carefully tie her ankles or knees together. This was a critical step. It ensured that in the final moments her body would not fall in an undignified or revealing position. Her last act was one of control, ensuring her modesty was preserved. Then she would take her kaiken, the dagger she had carried since her wedding day, and plunge it into the left side of her neck. The goal was to sever the carotid artery, leading to a quick death. Unlike seppuku, there was no kaishakunin, or second, standing by to deliver a final, merciful blow. Jigai was a solitary act. The woman faced her death completely alone, a final testament to her resolve. This practice of following a lord or husband in death, known as Junshi, became especially common during the chaotic warring states period of the 15th and 16th centuries. In an age of constant betrayal, it was the ultimate public display of loyalty. But when Japan entered a long period of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate in the 17th century, the authorities started to see things differently. Junshi was no longer viewed as a noble act, but as a barbaric and wasteful custom. The government wanted to break the intense personal bonds between retainers and their local lords, and reorient that loyalty towards the central government and the shogun himself. Losing a domain's most experienced warriors to ritual suicide was also just bad for business. So in the year 1663, the shogun officially outlawed Junshi. The punishments were severe. A man who committed Junshi was branded a traitor. His family could be stripped of their land and status, and even executed. The ban was largely effective, and the big, public displays of mass suicide mostly came to an end. But you can't outlaw an idea. The ideal of following one's master in death remained a powerful theme in art, literature, and theater, keeping the concept alive in Japan's cultural imagination. So what does this mean in practice? Let's look at the most famous samurai story of all, the tale of the 47 Ronin from 1703. After their lord was forced to commit seppuku, 47 of his samurai plotted for 2 years to avenge him. They succeeded, and as a result, were all sentenced to commit seppuku themselves. But what about their wives? There's no record of a mass suicide of the Ronin's wives. The ban was in full effect, and doing so would have brought disaster upon their children. Their primary duty shifted from their husbands to their heirs. But their story is still one of incredible sacrifice. They knew what their husbands were planning, and they supported them completely, enduring poverty and disgrace for the sake of their family's honor. In many ways, their stoic endurance was its own form of devotion, the female side of the Bushido code in action. But this brings us back to that night in 1912 and the story of General Nogi Maresuke and his wife Shizuko. This single event is the most famous and well-documented case of a wife committing junshi, and it happened long after the age of the samurai had officially ended. General Nogi was a national hero, a living symbol of the old samurai spirit in a rapidly modernizing Japan. His greatest fame came from the Russo-Japanese War, where he led the capture of Port Arthur. The victory was legendary, but it came at a horrific cost, with over 56,000 Japanese casualties, including both of General Nogi's sons. Nogi was consumed with guilt. He begged Emperor Meiji for permission to commit suicide to atone for the losses, but the emperor refused. He told Nogi that he must continue to live as long as the emperor himself lived. His wife, Shizuko, was the model of a traditional samurai wife. She was stoic, patient, and completely devoted to her husband. She managed the household with quiet dignity and endured the loss of her sons with the expected discipline of her class. So on the night of Emperor Meiji's funeral, General Nogi decided his obligation to live was finally over. Dressed in his full military uniform, he sat before a portrait of the emperor and wrote a long suicide note. He explained his death as junshi, an act of following his beloved emperor. He then committed seppuku in the brutal, classical way. In an adjoining room, Shizuko, dressed in a formal black kimono, was also ready. She followed the ancient ritual of Jigai, tying her legs together before taking a dagger to her heart. Her death was a deliberate, conscious act of following her husband, just as he was following his emperor. The news of their double suicide sent shockwaves across Japan and the world. In Japan, the reaction was mostly one of awe. The act was hailed as the ultimate expression of sincerity and loyalty, a beautiful and tragic reminder of the true Japanese spirit in an age of unsettling change. Intellectuals and writers debated its meaning, but the public saw it as a noble act. The Western world, however, was mostly horrified. They saw it as a barbaric relic from a feudal past, something totally incomprehensible to the modern mind. The Nogi suicide was a great paradox. It was an illegal act, yet it was celebrated as the highest virtue. It proved that even as Japan adopted Western technology and government, the core values of Bushido were still deeply embedded in the nation's psyche. So what is the legacy of this solemn practice? The ritual suicide of a samurai wife was a powerful symbol that reinforced the core values of Japanese society for centuries. It became a cornerstone of the romanticized image of the samurai, a tragic and beautiful ideal immortalized in plays and art. And the story continues to resonate. Today, General Nogi and his wife Shizuko are enshrined as deities at the Nogi Shrine in Tokyo. It's a popular place for people to pray for a faithful and devoted marriage, a testament to the enduring power of their story. When we look at this practice, it's easy to see it through a modern lens as the tragic result of a deeply oppressive patriarchal system, where a woman's life had no value without her husband. And that is certainly part of the truth, but it's also a story of incredible personal will. In a world that gave them very little control, the decision over their own death may have been the most absolute act of agency available to a samurai woman. It was a way for her to make a final, powerful statement about her honor and her own identity. The story of Jigai reminds us that history isn't just made on the battlefield with swords and grand armies. It's also written in the quiet, resolute hearts of those who lived within that world, defined by its code of honor, sorrow, and unwavering devotion. So what are your thoughts on this? Is it a tragic story of oppression or a noble tale of honor? Let us know down in the comments. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.